24th of December, 1945, New York City. A woman named Dorothy pressed her face against a frosted window and watched the street below. The neighbors had put lights up. Someone across the hall was playing carols on a radio. She'd made a turkey. She'd wrapped a small toy for the baby. Her husband had been in France for 2 years. The telegram had said, "Home alive by 45." It was a phrase that had been appearing in newspapers since September, a national promise. A collective prayer, printed on posters, and repeated on the radio, and written in letters sent to men still on the other side of the ocean. The war was over. The men were coming home. The army had guaranteed it. She waited until midnight. He didn't come. He didn't come because 250,000 American servicemen spent Christmas, 1945, stranded, some still on ships in the Atlantic, some sitting in transit camps in New Jersey with discharge papers in their pockets and no trains available. The Army's promise had met the North Atlantic in December, and the North Atlantic had not cared about Christmas. Here is what almost no one remembers about the end of World War II. The war ended in August 1945, but getting 8 million Americans home took another 14 months. It required 370 ships, 435,000 men per month, and a logistical effort larger than the invasion of Normandy run in reverse. And at the center of it, making voyage after voyage, carrying soldiers east to west, and then, in the final chapter, carrying something even more fragile, was a single ship, the Queen Mary. She was built to carry kings. She was painted gray and sent to carry soldiers. And in the winter of 1946, she carried 1,719 young women across the Atlantic, women who had never seen America, who had packed one suitcase, who had left their mothers at a dock in England because an American soldier had once asked them a question and they had said yes. This is the story of a Christmas that failed to happen, a promise the Army almost kept, and what it cost everyone involved. To understand why the Queen Mary became the center of all this, you need to understand what she was before the war changed everything. May 1936, Southampton, England. The crowd that had gathered on the waterfront that morning was not there for a sporting event or a parade. They were there because a nation that had spent 5 years in the grip of the Great Depression needed to watch something impossible happen. The Queen Mary was 1,019 feet long, longer than 3 city blocks. Her 3 funnels were so tall that a double-decker London bus could drive beneath the lowest one and not graze the paint. Her gross tonnage was 81,237, a number that meant almost nothing to anyone watching from the shore, except that it was larger than any number that had ever been attached to a ship. She had been built at the John Brown shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland, where the unemployment rate had been 30% when construction began in 1930. Then the money ran out. For 2 years, the half-finished hull sat in the yard. Workers went home. Families went hungry. When construction resumed in 1934, it was with the explicit understanding that this ship was not just a ship, it was proof that Britain could still make something worth looking at. Inside, she had a first-class dining room 3 decks tall. She had a ballroom, a swimming pool, a shopping promenade, a kennel deck for passengers' dogs, and a printing press that produced a daily newspaper. Her staterooms were decorated by some of the finest craftsmen in England, Art Deco panels in Australian walnut, a 60-foot mural of the British Empire painted on leather. She crossed the Atlantic 202 times before the war. She carried Cary Grant and the Duke of Windsor and Winston Churchill in peacetime, though Churchill would later make very different kinds of crossings on the same ship. She set the speed record for the Atlantic crossing in 1938, 3 days, 21 hours, and 48 minutes, and held it for 14 years. Then Germany invaded Poland. September 1939. The Queen Mary was mid-Atlantic, westbound, when the news reached her. The orders that followed were straightforward. Go dark. She arrived in New York with her portholes painted black and stayed there through the winter of 1939 to 1940, tied up alongside her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, both of them idle, while the world reorganized itself into something that would require different kinds of transportation. In March 1940, workers began stripping her out. The Art Deco panels came down. The walnut staterooms were gutted. The swimming pool was drained and fitted with steel-framed standy bunks, 5 tiers high, 18 inches of clearance between them. The ballroom became a dormitory. The first-class dining room became the enlisted men's mess hall, where 15,000 men would eat in rotating shifts. Her hull was repainted gray. The soldiers who sailed on her called her the Gray Ghost, partly for the paint and partly because she moved so fast, 28 knots in open water, that she could appear off a coast and be gone before anyone could respond. The German Navy offered the equivalent of $250,000 and the Iron Cross to any U-boat captain who could sink her. No one ever collected. In 5 years of war, with U-boats hunting the entire North Atlantic, the Queen Mary was never hit. She was not entirely lucky. On the 2nd of October 1942, off the coast of Ireland, running at full speed in heavy fog, she struck a British naval escort and cut it in half. The HMS Curacoa sank in 6 minutes. 338 men died. The Queen Mary's orders were explicit. In any incident, maintain speed and course. Stopping meant exposing herself and the 10,000 men in her holds to submarine attack. She went on. By 1945, she had carried 1,243,538 men to the theaters of war. Then the fighting stopped, and 8 million men needed to come home. Here is the number that makes Operation Magic Carpet hard to comprehend. At the peak of demobilization, November and December 1945, the United States was repatriating 430,000 servicemen per month. To put that in perspective, that is more than the entire population of Miami, Florida, transported across the Atlantic or the Pacific every single month for over a year. 370 ships were in active service. Aircraft carriers had their hangar decks stripped out and fitted with standee bunks. The USS Saratoga alone carried 29,204 men home by the end of the operation, more than any other single vessel. Battleships, destroyers, Liberty ships, Victory ships, every vessel that floated was pressed into service. And the Queen Mary, already running, already in the Atlantic, already the fastest thing on the water, was at the center of all of it. The phrase appeared in late September 1945, and within weeks it was everywhere. Home alive by 45. It was a slogan, but it felt like a contract. The war had been won in August. The men who had won it were now spread across 3 continents, waiting. In the Pacific, soldiers were garrisoned on islands so remote that their families in Ohio would have struggled to find them on a map. In Europe, 3 million Americans were occupying zones of former German territory, guarding supply lines, processing prisoners of war, performing the administrative work of a peace that nobody had yet fully figured out how to implement. The men were not patient. In Paris, American troops organized a nighttime march down the Champs-Élysées. Not a victory parade, a protest. They wanted to go home. In London, 500 American soldiers surrounded Eleanor Roosevelt's motorcade during an official visit and asked her, directly, in the street, when. In Manila, 4,000 servicemen stormed City Hall. Sergeant George Black led a demonstration outside the American Embassy in Paris in January 1946, holding signs that read, "We want ships." General George Marshall, watching the pressure build from Washington, wrote in his diary that the demobilization had become not a measured withdrawal, but a rout. The Army had a system. It was called the points system, and on paper it was equitable. You earned points for months of service, time in combat, wounds received, medals awarded, children waiting at home. A married man with 2 kids got more points than a single man. The men with the most points would go home first. In practice, it meant that a man who had spent 2 years fighting in the Pacific could find himself in September 1945, sitting in a tent on a Pacific island, doing arithmetic with a pencil, calculating whether he had earned enough points to get home before December 25th. The answer, for most of them, was no. Operation Santa Claus, the specific military sub-operation designed to accelerate Magic Carpet for the Christmas season, launched in October. The goal was to get every eligible American serviceman home by December 25th. The ships ran faster schedules. Priority boarding was extended to the highest point men. The railway system on the eastern seaboard was warned that it was about to be overwhelmed. It was overwhelmed. By Christmas Eve 1945, 94% of all westbound train passengers in the United States were recently discharged veterans trying to reach their families. The trains were not enough, the ships were not enough, the docks were not enough. 250,000 men who had technically reached American soil spent Christmas, 1,945 inches transit camps in New Jersey and Virginia, waiting for trains that hadn't arrived, making phone calls from payphones in processing centers to wives and parents who had been expecting them for weeks. Some civilians responded with the kind of unrehearsed generosity that only happens in moments of genuine collective relief. A taxi driver in Los Angeles drove a group of 6 veterans from the West Coast to Chicago 2,000 miles and accepted only the cost of the gasoline. Another drove 6 men to 6 different destinations, one at a time, over several days: Manhattan, the Bronx, Pittsburgh, Long Island, Buffalo, New Hampshire. He slept in the cab between drops. He asked for nothing. One veteran, asked years later what it was like to be home for Christmas, said, "I got home on December 27th. It was the best Christmas I ever had." The Queen Mary made 7 westbound crossings between June and December 1945, carrying an average of 14,500 men per voyage. She arrived in New York Harbor on each occasion to fireboats, spraying water in arcs across the harbor and crowds lining the Battery Park waterfront. The men stood on deck, on every railing, every hatch cover, every surface that would hold a person, and most of them were quiet. After 2 or 3 or 4 years, silence was the appropriate response to the size of what was happening. But even as the last of the soldiers were making their way home, the Army was facing a different problem: the women. Think about this. The War Brides Act was signed into law on the 28th of December 1945, 3 days after Christmas. The timing was not coincidental. The Army had spent the fall of 1945 getting men home. It had mostly succeeded. Now it had to reckon with a question that approximately 300,000 women in Britain, France, Italy, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines were asking: when do we come? In 1942, American servicemen began arriving in Britain. To women who had grown up in wartime England, who had watched their cities bombed, rationed their food, darned the same pair of stockings 6 times, the Americans seemed to arrive from a different world. Not because they were more interesting or more intelligent, but because they were confident in a specific way that England, after 3 years of war, had largely forgotten how to be. They expected things to be all right. They had cigarettes and chocolate and nylon stockings, and a kind of easy directness, a willingness to say what they meant, to ask a question without 4 layers of social pre-negotiation that a nation under siege sometimes loses. Some of them proposed marriage. The numbers are worth stating plainly. By the end of the war, 70,000 British women had married American servicemen. 47,783 more had married Canadians. There were also women from France, Italy, Australia, and the Philippines. From Japan, after the occupation began, there would be more. Altogether, roughly 300,000 women around the world had, in the years between 1941 and 1946, answered yes to a question asked by a man in an American uniform. Getting them to America turned out to be bureaucratically complicated in a way that nobody had fully planned for. The United States had a quota system. The Immigration Act of 1924, passed in an era of explicit anxiety about the ethnic composition of the country, had assigned specific numerical limits to immigration from each nation. Britain's quota was limited. A British woman married to an American soldier was not automatically entitled to enter the country. She had to apply. She had to qualify. She had to wait. Some men, once home, stopped writing. The army received a steady flow of letters from British women asking for information about husbands who had gone silent. Divorce lawyers in Las Vegas, which had a 6-week residency requirement, shorter than any other state, reported a sharp increase in business from recently returned servicemen in early 1946. Congress passed the War Brides Act on the 28th of December, 1945. It exempted the foreign-born spouses and children of American servicemen from the immigration quotas and authorized the Army to provide free transportation. The press, with characteristic American bluntness about such things, called the resulting operation Operation Diaper Run. 29 ships were fitted out for the purpose. Medical staff were brought on board. Formula, diapers, cribs. The ships carried women who had never been to America, most of whom had never been on any ship larger than a ferry, and a significant percentage of whom were bringing infants they had conceived after their husbands had already left for home. The first voyage left Southampton on the 26th of January 1946. The ship was the SS Argentina. There were 452 women on board and 173 children. The North Atlantic in January gave them 2 severe storms that pushed the crossing to 9 days instead of the usual 5 or 6. The women were seasick for most of it. They arrived in New York on February 4th. 6 days later, the Queen Mary followed. Her name was June. She was 18 years old. She had been born in Southampton, England, in approximately 1928. She had grown up during the war, the blackouts, the rationing, the particular dread of hearing German planes overhead on nights when the weather was clear enough for bombing. When the Americans came, she was 14. When one of them asked her to marry him a few years later, she said yes. On the 10th of February 1946, she walked up the gangplank of the Queen Mary at Southampton. She had 1 suitcase. She had her baby son in her arms. She had never been on a ship this size and never been to America. She was one of 1,719 women on that crossing and 615 children. The Queen Mary's wartime gray paint had not yet been replaced. She was still technically a military transport. But for this crossing, and the 5 more that would follow carrying war brides to America, she had been provisioned differently. The standee bunks had been replaced with actual beds. The mess hall rotations had been restructured to accommodate feeding toddlers. A small medical facility had been set up near the forward hold, and someone, it is not entirely clear who decided this, or who wrote it, had arranged for a newspaper to be published during the crossing. It was called Wives Away. It was 4 pages, mimeographed. It contained practical advice for women arriving in America: how to navigate a grocery store, what money looked like, how to call someone on a telephone without going through an operator, how to address people you didn't know. It contained letters from women who had made earlier crossings, small dispatches from the other side of arrival, reassurances that the process of becoming American was frightening but survivable. It had a social column that reported, in the slightly breathless style of ship newsletters everywhere, on the events happening on board, a card game in the dining room, a talent show in which some of the children had performed. "We were all in the same situation," June later said. "We were coming to a new country. We left our families behind. We were coming to see our husbands we hadn't seen in so long. I can't remember any problems. We all got along so good." The crossing took 5 days. They played shuffleboard on the promenade deck in February cold. They ate at long tables in the dining room that had once served 5-course dinners to film stars, and was now feeding young women who had traded the most familiar thing in the world, their home country, for a promise made in wartime by a man they were beginning to realize they didn't entirely know. Some were excited, some were frightened in ways they couldn't yet name. The two things were not mutually exclusive. They arrived in New York Harbor on February 14th, 1946, Valentine's Day. The men were waiting on the docks. Here is what the welcome home photographs don't show. Some of the men on the dock that day had brought their mothers, and some of the mothers had not been pleased when their sons wrote home from England to say they had gotten married. The women who came over on those crossings, the 70,000 British war brides, the thousands from France and Australia and Italy, arrived in a country that was happy to have won the war, but not entirely sure what to do with the evidence of how globally it had been fought. They arrived in small towns in Iowa and Mississippi where people had never met anyone from England. They arrived in families that had been hoping for a different kind of daughter-in-law. Some of them were welcomed warmly. Many were not, or not entirely, or not at first. They formed clubs. In cities across the country, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Indianapolis, women who had made the crossing found each other and organized what they called cosmopolitan clubs, places where a woman could spend an afternoon with people who understood, without explanation, what it meant to be simultaneously grateful and homesick, simultaneously committed to a life you had chosen and quietly devastated by what you had left behind. Some of the marriages didn't survive the transition. A woman named Bridget Waters arrived in America to find that her husband had already filed for divorce in Las Vegas, citing irreconcilable differences. She contested it, funded by a British women's organization. The case was covered in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. The women who stayed, and most of them stayed, built their American lives in the quiet way that people build lives, through the accumulation of ordinary days until the ordinary days become the only life they know. The Queen Mary made her last war bride crossing in June 1946. The War Brides Act's provisions were fully implemented by the end of the year. Operation Magic Carpet was officially closed in September 1946. By then, 8,021,000 American servicemen and servicewomen had been repatriated. It was the largest sealift in human history. The record will likely never be broken. The Queen Mary was returned to Cunard in September 1946, and workers spent months restoring her. The Art Deco panels went back up. The chandeliers were reinstalled. The first-class dining room got its tablecloths back. She returned to passenger service in July 1947 to a reception that can only be described as a hero's welcome. The late 1940s and 1950s were good years for her. She was exactly what she had been designed to be, the fastest, largest, most prestigious ship on the Atlantic. She carried royalty. She broke her own speed records. She was, in the decade after the war, a symbol of a return to normalcy, so complete that it felt almost like an insult to how abnormal things had been. Then the jets came. On the 4th of October 1958, a Boeing 707 crossed the Atlantic in 6 hours and 17 minutes. The Queen Mary took 4 days. Within a few years, the math of ocean travel changed entirely. The wealthy flew. The business people flew. Even immigrants, who might once have saved for years to make the crossing in third class, now arrived at airports rather than seaports. Cunard held on through the early 1960s, but the losses were enormous. She consumed a crew of over 1,000 people and fuel costs that the passenger revenue could no longer justify. In 1967, the decision was made. She made her final Atlantic crossing in September 1967. From Southampton, she sailed south, around Cape Horn, up the Pacific coast. She arrived in Long Beach, California, on the 9th of December 1967, having been purchased by the city for $3.45 million. The crowd that turned out to meet her was 150,000 people. She had crossed the Atlantic 1,001 times. Long Beach's plan was to turn her into a hotel, museum, and maritime attraction. For a while, it worked. Through the 1970s and 1980s, couples got married on her promenade deck, tourists walked her corridors, schoolchildren came on field trips. A themed English village was built alongside her, full of shops and restaurants meant to evoke the Southampton she had left behind. But a ship that doesn't move starts to die in place. The hull that had been designed for the self-cleaning effect of constant motion began to corrode when it was stationary. Systems designed for a vessel that would be regularly overhauled in dry dock were stretched beyond their maintenance schedules. Operators came and went, companies that promised restoration and delivered neglect. In 2018, a Long Beach City report estimated that the Queen Mary required between $235 million and $289 million in immediate repairs to prevent catastrophic structural failure. The phrase was used in the official report without apparent irony. In 2020, the company operating her urban commons declared bankruptcy. Its principals, Taylor Woods and Howard Wu, faced charges of defrauding investors of $70 million. During their years in charge, the English village alongside the ship had been allowed to deteriorate so completely mold in the walls, holes in the roof, vermin, asbestos, homeless encampments, that the city of Long Beach demolished it in April 2025. The Queen Mary herself still floats. She still takes visitors. She still hosts weddings and corporate events. But in the sections below deck that have been closed to the public for years, in the corridors where men once slept in standy bunks on their way to war, in the holds where war brides once walked with their suitcases and their babies, the salt air continues its patient, uncelebrated work. In 2013, a woman named June Boots returned to the Queen Mary for the first time since 1946. She was 85 years old. Her husband, Boots, had died the year before. Going through their house in Indianapolis after his death, she had opened a box she had stored in a closet. Inside, a copy of Wives Away, the newsletter from the 5-day crossing in February 1946. 2 white identification cards on strings, the tags she and her son had worn during the crossing, printed with their names and destination. Menus from the dining room, printed on heavy cardstock with the Queen Mary's name at the top. She had kept them for 67 years. "I'd forgot I even owned it," she said. "I figured if my children found the box one day, they would just throw it out. It wouldn't mean anything to them." She brought the box to Long Beach. She donated everything to the ship's museum. The ship that had brought her to America was where her archive of the crossing belonged. There is a version of this story that is only about triumph. 8 million soldiers came home. A nation reunited. The Queen Mary carried 15,000 men per voyage, made run after run, never got hit, and crossed the Atlantic more than 1,000 times. And when the soldiers were done, she carried the women who had followed them across the same ocean, in the same hull, to the same harbor. That version is true, but it is not the whole story. The men who came home on the Queen Mary in 1945 were not the same men who had left. This is obvious, and it is almost impossible to fully convey. The Army gave returning soldiers a brief medical examination, a handshake, discharge papers, and a train ticket home. There was no counseling, because the concept barely existed in its modern form. There was no transition program. The assumption stated explicitly in some of the Army's own documentation was that the men would simply resume their pre-war lives, slipping back into their families and their towns and their jobs as though the interruption had been a long business trip. Some did. Many did not. Or not entirely. Or not for years. The war brides faced a parallel set of dislocations, different in character but not in magnitude. They had crossed an ocean to be with men they had mostly known in wartime, in unusual circumstances, when everyone was living with the kind of intensity that proximity to death produces. What they found on the other side was ordinary life, American ordinary life, which was foreign in ways that went beyond the accents and the money and the food. There is a small, specific, almost undocumented history buried inside Operation Magic Carpet, the history of what happened after the homecomings, the cases that didn't resolve happily, the marriages that didn't survive the transition from wartime love to peacetime reality, the women who arrived in America to find something different from what had been promised. Most of the accounts that survive are the ones that did survive, the Junes, who built their lives in Indianapolis, who raised children and grandchildren, who kept their crossing documents in boxes and brought them back to the ships that carried them. These are the stories that made it to the archives, to the museum display cases, to the oral histories. The other stories went unarchived. They went silent. Long Beach, California. Right now, the Queen Mary sits at a pier on the south side of the harbor, her black and red paint bright in the Southern California sun, her 3 funnels visible from miles away. She is, by any measure, still beautiful. Beautiful in the way that old things are beautiful when they have endured more than seemed survivable. The 2028 Los Angeles Olympics are coming. Long Beach will host 11 sporting events: sailing, open water swimming, beach volleyball. The city is building a 12,000-seat outdoor amphitheater nearby. The waterfront is being remade. The Queen Mary's future remains officially uncertain. The city says it is committed to her preservation. The repair estimates continue to climb. The sections that have been closed for years remain closed. Inside, somewhere, in a glass case in the museum on her second deck, there is a small mimeographed newspaper from February 1946 and 2 white identification cards on strings, and menus from a crossing that changed a young woman's life. She brought 14,000 soldiers into New York Harbor on a June morning in 1945. They stood on every surface, every railing, every inch of open deck, and they were quiet, because silence was the only response that matched the size of what was happening. 6 months later, she brought 1,719 women across the same ocean. Women who had packed 1 suitcase. Women who had kissed their mothers goodbye at a dock and not known when they would see them again. Women who said yes in wartime and then had to figure out what yes meant in peacetime. She is still there. The question is for how long. There is something about the Christmas 1945 story that doesn't resolve cleanly, and that is the thing that makes it worth telling. The promise was real. The effort was genuine. The taxi driver in Los Angeles, who drove strangers 2,000 miles and asked for nothing that happened, the couples who reunited on the docks in December, the children who met their fathers for the first time, the women who stepped off the Queen Mary and into America on Valentine's Day 1946. All of that happened. And the 250,000 men who spent Christmas in transit camps also happened. And the women whose husbands had stopped writing also happened. And the Queen Mary, sitting in Long Beach with water in her hull and sections that have been closed for years, also happened. These things are not contradictions. They are the same story. A nation tried to keep a promise, and mostly succeeded. And the gap between mostly and completely is where the real history lives. Somewhere in Indianapolis, there is a family descended from a young woman who packed one suitcase in Southampton in February 1946 and crossed the Atlantic on a gray ship called the Queen Mary. She kept a newsletter and 2 identification tags and some menus in a box for 67 years because she wasn't entirely ready to let go of the evidence that something frightening had also been, in its way, worth remembering. She left them to the ship in the end. The ship that brought her here. Did anyone in your family come home on the Queen Mary, either as a soldier in 1945 or as a war bride in 1946? Or do you have a Home Alive by 45 story that never quite worked out the way it was supposed to? Leave it in the comments. These stories are still out there. They deserve to be told before the people who lived them are gone. If this is the kind of history that gets left out of the official version, subscribe. This is what we do here.